My name is Greg Bliss, and I am from Grand Rapids, Michigan. I had a very interesting journey to come to Grand Rapids. I had finished up schooling down south in Greenville, South Carolina, and I moved out west for a while. I decided to move back to Michigan, which is my home state. And I ended up with a group of artists and actors and directors in Jackson, Michigan. We put together the Michigan Shakespeare Festival. And through my involvement in theater, I met a group in Grand Rapids who was looking for a director to direct two special one-acts. They wanted to do something different with their theater group because it was a small theater group, and they wanted to do something that was a little edgy. And they thought maybe by bringing a director from outside, that would be great. The name of the group was Master Arts Theater, and they wanted to do two one-acts by Chaim Potok. And so I agreed to do that. And I came up, I fell in love with Grand Rapids. Now, ironically, I hung out with a lot of Kendall students. So my thinking about moving here was that, the Kendall students, all the art downtown and so forth. And here's this theater group that wants to do some really cool off the beaten path one acts. That's great. And when I did move here, wanting to move downtown, I ended up moving into sort of the rural area, or not the rural area, but Kentwood, actually, at the time, back in '96. And it was a little bit different from downtown. I'm like, oh man, I want to be downtown. And that was my beginning. Through Master Arts Theater, I worked and did some projects with very special arts, which was great. I took Shel Silverstein's The Missing Piece and took it into elementary school classrooms, and we acted out the missing piece with students. So for me, that was exciting because I had been writing poetry. I was excited to work with students and watch them embrace and understand poetry in a way that was fresh and different. And then I also created masks and worked with somewhat older students, middle school grade students, and they would do poetry through the masks, and we would see how that would change. I did one class in particular with Bethany Christian Services, and it was very interesting because these students had been so traumatized in their life path that no one was able to be within a certain distance of one another because it might trigger something they had been through. And they really couldn't tell me this in advance because that would predispose me to perhaps some idea of them. And so it was a great learning opportunity. And I would say that my entire path here in Grand Rapids has been full of learning opportunities like that. The first person that probably introduced me and gave me a book of poetry was a retired couple. I remember her name. Her name is Myrnie Bonner, and her husband, who always skulked the route in the back. So we knew her. My sisters and I knew her, and she knew that I loved to read. She gave me my first copy of Shakespeare. Now, I wasn't really readily diving into the plays, but there was these sonnets in the back, and I thought they were pretty cool. And so I sort of dove into those. Also, I must say that I had a huge collection of books that my grandfather had acquired from the Bedford High School library. That's where he worked as a custodial person until the day he died. And so I started digging through all these books that I had because I really hadn't thought a whole lot about poetry, and found books of poetry that he had given me, but at the time when I was younger, I really did not embrace. And so it was, but I would say it was that collection of Shakespeare that really got me interested. When I was in college, I think the other thing that really got me interested in understanding poetry were two books, primarily. There was one book that was called The Black Poets, and it was unlike anything I'd ever read. historically speaking, also just the manner in which the poems were written. And I'm trying to remember the name of the author of this poem. I'm dropping it right now, but there's a poem called 38. And the 38 I decided to do as a performance piece in college. And it scared the liver out of my poor classmates who were primarily Southerners and conservative Christians, as was myself. But the 38 is basically a poem about a man who comes into a room, and it's a family situation, and he pulls a gun from a dresser and fires it into the room. And it breaks it down into every split second frame of the action. The whole poem was every second of the action. And I thought, my God, that's what poetry can be. That is. And that just took me on a journey to discover and read and find anything I had not embraced before. The first time that I had to memorize a poem and perform it for a competition was in college. And unfortunately, I had a teacher that really liked a poem that I thought, well, it's an interesting poem, but it was difficult to perform with vigor. And so I had to learn how to perform it with meaning. And I did learn a lot about creating different layers. The poem is The Love Song of J.F. Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. Not exactly the most exciting poem you've ever heard in your life. But the other thing that poem did for me was, in researching the poem, I researched it and I found a volume that had all of the references to classical literature and any other references that T.S. Eliot had used in creating that poem. And I realized, I think for the first time, the manner in which a poem can be broken down and the manner in which a poem can be little pieces coming from so many different sources and placed together. And I sought to do that with my own poetry. And I would say that really was formative in my life. 96, 98 was, it was a very interesting time to be here, because this was right before, this was actually, I would say, as Grand Rapids was starting to sort of slowly move into a Renaissance period. And it wasn't quite at that phase, but it definitely was moving toward that period. However, I must say that during that period, and I started immediately doing some work with UICA. I eventually worked for UICA from, I think, 98 to pretty much 99, the beginning of 2000. But you would go downtown on the weekend, and there wasn't much going on. There was the Van Andel Arena. There was the Civic Theater. There was not a whole lot going on. There was the Amway Grand. And there was Blues on the Mall. That was awesome. That was great. And so there were things, but it was, if you would take the Wayback Machine right now and go back, you would not believe how sparse and few and far between the opportunities were. But that was right before what I consider to be the renaissance of this wonderful area. I started looking for poetry in Grand Rapids when I was working at USCA. And I worked with Rachel Finan, and we started a group called the X Performance Group. We did performance art, we did new plays, and we started this thing called 24-hour theater. But we were hungry for more and looking for other opportunities. We discovered a form called Buteau, and Rachel really, really glommed onto that. That was so her. And so she took that and went in that direction. And I wanted, I had participated when I lived in Jackson in some workshops in Ann Arbor with what I consider to be probably one of my early mentors, a guy that was one of the directors there. And we we didn't find anything. There was not really much going on. Now, had I been a student somewhere, there was a lot going on, I would say, in colleges, universities, and so forth. But I was just looking for a reading locally. Somebody told me that there was a poetry reading in Easttown, and they couldn't remember the name of the venue, but that there was a Buddha on the side of the wall of the building. So I went down to Easttown, and I tried looking for this building that had a Buddha on the side of the wall, and I couldn't find it.
Looking for landmarks.
Yeah, I couldn't find it. I'm like, what are you talking about? I happened to walk into this place called Gold Coffee Company, and I got a cup of coffee, and I thought this could be a good place to do poetry. And then I thought nothing of it. One of the people that I was working with, his name was Tony Tift. We found this venue in Kalamazoo that was actually doing slams. It was called the Craft Barrel. So he said, let's go to the Craft Barrel. Let's see what's going on down there. So he started taking some trips down to the Craft Barrel. We hit up a couple of their shows. And on the way back from Kalamazoo, Tony said to me, why aren't we doing this? And I'm like, that's what I'm thinking. We can do this. So I would say that the inspiration was this show that was happening at the Craft Barrel at that time. And we talked to the owner of the Gold Coffee Company, and they were a little bit like, huh? You want to, what, huh? I said, it'll be good, it'll be good. And so we started some open mics there. We called it the Pillory. We called it the Pillory because we thought that the idea of the poet being the person in the stocks in the middle of town square being sort of mocked. We watched the manner in which the audience sometimes interacts with poets. And oftentimes, as a poet, when you're up there performing, it feels like punishment sometimes. So we just thought, that's kind of a catchy name. Let's just go with that. I've thought a lot about the two poets that actually spoke to me most directly. And as much as I hated performing the love song of Gerald Prufrock, I believe that T.S. Eliot had a huge impact on me. Mainly because T.S. Eliot was a student of classical literature, and to understand his work, you really have to dig deep. And I wanted my work to have this sense of understanding other languages, other literature, but to do so in a cultural way, not to be, shall we say, so obtuse that you had to go take a class on Western literature to understand anything that I wrote. I wanted my work to have an element of research, an element of connectivity with different sources. That's part of it. The poet Don L. Lee actually, specifically a poem of his entitled A Poem to Complement Other Poems, really, really got me. And it got me because not only the rhythms that he created, but the force of his language and the way that he used repetition. He used repetition masterfully. He was also somebody I didn't know anything about. And so I think that also Langston Hughes was huge for me. That was a major shift in my own reading and writing. But I also, I didn't want I wanted my poetry to be based on my life experiences and also everything that I read. So it was also news articles, poetry that I just heard, at an open mic. I would say really that my writing is more grounded in non-poetry literature. To be honest, I didn't have a mentor that was really grooming me and showing me a lot of great poetry. I think growing up the way that I did, the poetry that was idolized was the Book of Psalms, and that's great and it's wonderful, but that was it. So there wasn't really any, what poems did I have on a wall in my house other than footprints in the sand? Okay, you know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's pretty harsh on my family, but I'm saying I had to go look outside of that. I really did, and I enjoyed the journey of looking outside for that. I brought Todd Bannon and Kevin Wixom down from Kalamazoo, and we started the slam. It started at Gold, which became Morningstar 75. That grew very quickly. We were doing the open mics, and that's great. And you can have, and mind you, what was very interesting about that particular venue was that you have the window, you have the door, and then you have the machine in the back making the espresso. So between somebody walking in the door going, hey, and in the back, and everybody else, it was, you had to be pretty tough to read in that environment. We also would have people come up to the window and, they thought they were going to be, I don't know if they thought they were being videotaped or what was going on, but they wanted to be part of the scene. So you had to be focused. You had to not be distracted. I think at the time, there was no one to speak of. There's no one that you would know right now that was really going to the show, other than the only person that I know of that is still in this area is Nate Dannison. Nate Dannison was part of our first team. Mike Dykstra was there. Matt Simpson was there. Matt Siegel-Simpson was there. But a lot of the people that were there are gone now. They've moved on. Justin Valmasoy and his gang of guys and girls that ran that shop, they were there. And that was a very interesting relationship because I think that everybody there was well-read. And the walls were full of all kinds of indie posters for, off the beaten path music, the intelligent music, the smart kid music. And it was true. There was a level of intelligence and understanding that I think was there that was higher than the norm. But most everybody that was there was moving on, and there was a real flux. Yeah, our first team went out in 2001, and then, let's talk about the change. Let's talk about the shift because that'll be interesting. So we're putting together a nonprofit organization called Praxis Manifest. We're thinking about, let's build something that we're looking way down the road. We put together our first team and we went to nationals in Seattle. And that was a great experience. When we came back, it was a few weeks after we came back, that was in August. And on September 11, we had 9/11. And the impact that had on our community, at least, was chilling. It was difficult, not so much to write, because I think people were writing, but it was difficult to perform in an aggressive manner on a microphone when there was so much that we were processing as individuals, as Americans, and as humans. It was difficult. And we could feel that. So at the time, we said, let's take a break. Let's ride this out. Let's find out where people are at. And then the crew that was working together to put this together sort of dissipated, went back to Kalamazoo. I continued to work with Todd Bannon, but we moved on. In the next 2 years, now, where we had the first competition, the first slam, and the finals for the slam was at Pop Cafe, which is now Hookah Lounge. Same space. And I have to say that there's something about, and I do believe this, that energy is retained in a space. And I do believe that whatever energy happened in that building from the very beginning continues forward. I believe that is the longest running open mic at this point. But it was exciting to see that come back later. So there's one aspect of evolution. So the Pop Cafe was there for a while. It had some financial ups and downs. There were things in and out of there for a little bit. And then we moved a lot of our shows down to 10 Weston Theater. That became the other Morning Star. So there's Morning Star in Easttown, and then we had Morning Star at 10 Weston, which for us was a more successful place. To describe the space, Anybody that knows anything about 10 Weston from back in the day would know there were punk shows there. There was all kinds of wonderful art gatherings and gallery showings. Jean Dole had run that space for quite some time. I'm not sure the exact parameters of when she ran it, but I worked with her for a while. And then I believe she relinquished the space, and that's when Morningstar took it over. And we were there, I would say the next phase of evolution, we were there for a couple years. We decided to put a team back together. In those 2 years that we were off as not having a Grand Rapids team, I became involved with the Kalamazoo team. I was able to go to 4 national poetry slams, which was wonderful. It was a fantastic experience. I am so grateful for the part of my life that was. But in that time, we also became involved with the Rust Belt Slam. And I was actually part of a group that worked with Tracy Smith in Kalamazoo to help bring that. It had taken a hiatus for a little bit, and we brought it back. And so we were competing in Columbus with poets from this area. But then in 2004, we decided, look, we're ready to go back. Let's go back to the slam. And we put together a team and went to St. Louis. In all honesty, I would say that the organization of that particular national event was unfortunate. And so we decided to take a small break again after that and just, put it on the back burner, continue to do slams, continue to have open mics, and revisit it when we felt we were ready. And then we lost our venue. And then as we're progressing into the latter 2000s, we have a lot of, we had the real estate bubble burst. And so it made it a little trickier. At that time, we started looking for other places. And I have a short stack and list of places where we did shows. And we don't have to go through all that. That's not necessary. But we found places. So instead of having this home, we found places that were willing to have us do shows during interim periods. Did shows at Sazerac, Quinn & Toots, other places. And we found time slots where they were not too overly busy, times during the year when they were not overly busy. And we might take a break, say when it was a special holiday, St. Patrick's Day, Christmas, Thanksgiving, things like this. But we continued to do shows. We did slams at the festival. We did an intersection slam where we raised money for the first slam team. That's when the intersection was down in Easttown. And it was really weird to me because I believe I had just seen Guar perform there. So it was kind of really a weird thing to be on that stage. We did shows at the Hookah Lounge. We did shows we did an open mic at what is now Rumors. We did the Sazerac show. We did a Schuler's feature and bi-monthly open mic. And I'm trying to think of any other venues at this point. And then I have another list of other things, other events that we did. Also, one thing, and I failed to mention this, is that when we did the slam, the first slam in 2001, we put together a youth slam that performed in Ann Arbor that spring. It was April. And our team took 4th place nationally, which was kind of cool, mainly because they didn't go overtime. They followed the rules, but we had a good team. Other places where I was involved with, I was invited in 2009 to work with the Graham, and I worked with Carrie Vanderhoff, and we did a Krezek poetry there, where I brought in poets, and we would assign them to paintings or sculpture, and then we had a couple nights where patrons could come in and they would receive a ticket, and they would go to a painting or a sculpture, and they would give the ticket to the poet, and then others would gather. They could figure out where they wanted to go, and they would wait till they had enough. And the patrons would literally have to observe the painting or the work of art for as long as the poem that was written about that painting was being performed. And the one thing that people said that they really enjoyed about that was that it forced them to slow down. How many times have they gone through the gram and gone and taken a look, oh, that's nice, and then moved on? And with this particular way of viewing and experiencing poetry, they had a chance not only to see and to hear, what the poet had to say, but to absorb their own thoughts and juxtapose those with what the poet had seen. So it was kind of a magical moment. Poetry is math. It's math. And every aspect of our being is math. The trajectory of our life is math. And poetry does something to connect with us on such a deep level that even for a beginning poet, I believe that there's a spiritual awakening that happens when poetry is engaged. And especially when poetry is spoken and shared in a communal event. And the reason why I say that is I have seen this magical connection, this deep, profound spiritual connection happen with a young poet that comes up to the microphone and is nervous, and perhaps their writing is, it's coming to bloom, it's blooming, it's just beginning. But their sense of themselves, the sense of what they have to say, and the work they put into crafting this piece, it carries. It connects with somebody in that room. Somebody in that room gets it the way they get it. And it's healing, directly healing. Now, on a larger scale, I will have to say that I believe, especially with the manner in which the diatribe has been engaging students and the manner in which I think over a long period of time, spoken word has engaged audiences, that it has opened up hearts and minds. It has allowed people to talk about gender and about identity issues and about racism, about classism, about all these things in a way that is healing, that isn't, red versus blue, but it is, we're all here. We're all here right now. What's going on? Tell me what you're seeing. Tell me what you've gone through. Tell me the secret missing piece that you've seen that I'm looking for. And there's been so many times when I've walked out of a venue and I'm like, oh man, I needed to hear that. How did they know that? And there's been so many times, and you've seen this, when common threads, like there's this silver burning thread that happens throughout the course of a night or the course of a reading. And people start connecting and things start falling in line. And you feel it and you know it. And because it's us healing together, healing one another. I believe that it has helped our culture, and I believe it's helped our city. I believe this city is a different place because of the art and all of the motion and the energy and the resources that have been put into allowing people to learn, to express, and to grow in whatever idiom they actually, whatever suits them. So the comment that I have about performance is this. I really hate the curtain call. I love the energy and the nowness of performing and of reading a poem and connecting with the audience, but I just want to walk away and crawl into a corner afterwards. I don't want to be known for anything. I don't really want to be famous, but I love connecting people together. I remember having a poet come from Florida and them saying, What's with Grand Rapids? You guys are all about the hookup. You guys like to connect things together. You help one another out. Like it's weird. There's artists and poets and writers and musicians, and you're not necessarily all in your own little things. You're all kind of doing things together. And I do believe that that's part of what happened here. And I also have to say, when I moved here, I also found, and I walked into a city of giants. Now, you may say, yeah, there wasn't a whole lot going on, but there's a lot going on. A lot going on. I walked into a city where philanthropy and giving was so a part of the fabric of this city, and so a part of the fabric and the thinking of individuals, that this is why it was possible for me to go and to do a lot of shows and to get people inspired and get people together. When I worked at UICA, I was part of that process. I wrote grants. When I worked at Master Arts, I wrote grants. But specifically when I worked at UICA, and I wanted to go into this a little bit because really, I mean, the only way that I was able to really get out and do a lot, and I did a lot, I was doing stuff all the time, constantly. We were just kind of scraping the surface of it here. But I was able to do that because I had the foundation of the UICA. Now, I worked with the UICA when the UICA moved from downtown. And I remember walking in for my job interview, and it was a bank where now are the steps to the Graham. And we moved everything over to Sheldon, and we got everything in place, and we were ready to open, and we had a great opening. It was fantastic. But within the first few months, we realized that one of the things that had been donated was a heating and air conditioning system, and it was beautiful, it was wonderful, but it had sat outside for a while, and it had damage, and it was not functioning efficiently, and they were going to have to get a new system, and it was costing us thousands of dollars to keep the place open. My first son had just been born, okay? So, and we were at the point of, we're going to need more money, and we already raised all the money to get this building. So one of my roles was not only taking the money to the bank, but going and receiving donations from individuals. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the people that I did get donations from, but I want to tell you that people who already gave much more. And I remember going down to Meijer Corporate and having them sign checks that kept us paid for weeks. So when I started launching all of these projects, I was able to sustain my own personal life because of those donations and the giving that happens in this city. In 2002, I was asked to be one of the preliminary judges, and that was a great experience. I also brought samples of chapbooks from slams, and I said, now wouldn't it be really cool if we had a collection of the winners that looked like these chapbooks? And so I handed off this collection that I had found, and the result was that a different type of book representing the collection of the winners was created. That was really exciting. I was glad to see that. I must say that one of the mainstays in all of the shows was the time of year when Dire Ives' poetry competition came around. It was awesome. And I'll tell you, it was really great because there was the process of getting the posters, going down to the library, going to other places. Now, back then you had to be careful about where you put the posters. And so we would get permission. And I think one of the lingering memories for me of the Dire Ives competition were the readings of the winners. It was almost like walking into a sanctuary, the quiet beauty of it. When Carrie Vanderhoff invited me to host an exhibition poetry slam at the Graham, we also discussed the Poetry on Demand series. And I immediately thought of what poets can I connect with that write poetry that will be easily digested by people who read poetry and go to poetry readings. And there's a difference. If I had brought people that were doing very bombastic performance poetry to the Gram, it would not have worked. And so the goal was to bridge that gap. In this situation, I invited Dr. David Landrum, Melissa Ray, Ali Merrick, Patrick Revere, Diane Baum, Mike Green, and Neil Kaufman to participate in the first series, and then most of them were involved in the next year's series. How I knew Melissa Ray was that she started coming to my shows. And she was a very timid soul, but she wrote amazing poetry. And so, you know, one of the things I enjoyed about doing these shows in very unusual places, or places that were not necessarily libraries and schools and so forth, was that we would find and net in the folks that wanted to read that might find it difficult to go somewhere else. I will also say that one of the most beautiful things about the shows was that unexpected poet, that new poet, that poet that also came that was a professor and was willing to come down to our humble coffee shop and read. Those moments are indelible in my memory, and they changed the trajectory of the audience members. Absolutely. I believe that perhaps in the past we waited too late to bring poetry into the classrooms. Like I said before, poetry is math. It is our way of understanding how we are all connected. There is something that happens. It is almost as if a thread connects from the poet and the reader to every single person in the audience or to the person reading the book, and connects them through space and time itself. You become that person. You travel where they traveled. You feel the emotions they feel. You understand what they understand. You let down whatever mask you have. You let down whatever prejudice you have. And perhaps for the first time, for that new idea or that new way of looking at life, you say, I'm listening. It opens the ears and opens the heart and the mind, and it has to happen as early as possible. I do believe that. My involvement with Mentally Distilled is probably rooted in my involvement with ZZ Jasper. I remember when he would come into our shows and he would give a little history lesson for a lot of our patrons that didn't know a whole lot about the history that he knew about. And he was gentle and direct and kind and brilliant. And so I believe that we worked on projects after that. One of them was the Easttown Hookah Lounge. In fact, he and Ali Merrick and myself were the first ones that approached him about doing poetry there. And that evolved into adding Keegan. And then there was like a little fluctuation, and it ended up, I think, being ZZ and Keegan for a while. And then every once in a while, he'd have me come in and help co-host a little bit. But then my life trajectory took me into a more quiet phase. And I was working third shift, and I remember, I will never forget, getting the phone call from Marcel. And I was working third shift. So when I got the phone call at 2:00 in the afternoon, I was like, huh? And he said, hey, you want to help us get this slam going again? I'm like, yes, absolutely. It was like coming back from the dead. I felt like Lazarus. And my understanding of the slam was rooted in a time when it was a little bit different. It had grown. And so I was able to bring that understanding, but that it had developed, it had evolved. And so there was other places it needed to go. And so I was useful in helping you go forward, but then give you the baton and you take it all the way to the 2017 return of Grand Rapids to the slam community in terms of national competition, which was so, so exciting. The future is hard to understand right now, especially given world events. But I would say that the future is now. The future is what the diatribe is doing right now. And I believe that the future is sustaining your goals, sustaining what is happening, what you're doing in the schools, what you're doing in the community, keep it going. That's all. And we don't know what the future will be. The future, it's like watching water roll down a hill. We don't know where that water's going to go, but we have to keep the flow going. Just keep the flow going. That's what the future is. This poem is the poem that I wrote for the first Poetry on Demand series in 2009 for the Grand Rapids Art Museum. It was based on the winner of ArtPrize that year. It is entitled Death by Water. I have dreamed of death by water, dissolving into the sinews of the sea, a mellifluous crustacean bending backwards, slipping sideways through surging waves of age and youth, throbbing between crest and trough, a fisherman's glass ball bobber netting plankton beneath phalanges, exchanging kelp for keratin until completely homogenized, a swaying formulation following the alchemy of the moon's luring, languid fingers, found at last as fragile fractals clinging to clean, clever shells, hermits lounging in anonymous tidal pool dioramas. And I have dreamed of waking from water, not altogether undone, floating between fragments of wreckage, simmering in equatorial sun, brine crystallizing from the rim of my contour, reaching toward points of compass poised inward. Or rather, the delicate spires of a geode cracked perfectly along thin fault lines. A donation dazzling in dank doldrums waiting to be sampled by some certain aquatic biologist, cataloged and banded according to the genus of my previously unclassified self. I sing to my death by water, confessing certain seasonal affectations, reciting the record of her puckish grip, pulling me under waist deep in seemingly safe Sunday afternoon surf along Stone Harbor. She laughs, cresting between penalty and perjury, recalls lost passages of Phoenician and Viking, Grecian and Spaniard, Polynesian and Somali. Safer to sail by land, she snickers, settling into her subtler irony. Of course, once the world was flat, forever I, falling from off the edges of the plate, my siren seekers dropping into a melting Milky Way, diving into Promethean pockets of passing planets. But then I transformed into a curious sphere, suspicious cartographers stretching continents across the supple center of my sacrum, mapping oceans where land clearly had erupted from violent, molten vents, a diaspora of disinformation waiting for clever machinations to catch up with continental curiosity. But mostly, I am voluminous. More life buried beneath my blue than serialized space from synchronized satellite lenses. And so I wait for you to continue forgetting and remembering me, diving deeper into not until recently recorded chronology, technology scattered throughout the galaxy, spotting etchings, mere possibilities of the prosaic penetration of yourselves reflected between radio transmissions, where once was ice water, where once water a sea, perchance then oceans, and if oceans, then perhaps eternity. And so I woke a third time, collecting sticky cerulean brushes, folding easel and sketches into the corners of a beachcomber's canvas sack. She did not speak, rather sorrowfully stared through me with green, clear envy. How fortunate to play the funambulist, crossing tenderly on bare feet between her liquid lips and the dry serenity of solid sand. Well, I didn't get to mention David Cope. And I have to tell you, of all the times, if I had a dime for every time a poet said, I've studied with David Cope, or David Cope was my teacher, or one of the teachers at the community college or Grand Valley State University, but specifically, for many years, I wondered who David Cope was, and then I finally got to meet him. I was able to do what I did because of what happened in the classrooms in this city. And that's the bottom line.